Today, the great sanctuary was flooded with a blinding, merciless light pouring through the high windows, striking the polished stone floors like blades. It was a day meant for a royal wedding, a day of union where treaties were sealed in gold and bloodlines secured. Yet, as the string orchestra played a flawless, soaring melody from the upper balconies, the music did not feel like a celebration. It felt like a march toward a battlefield. Hundreds of aristocrats from the kingdom's most powerful houses stood in neat, jewel-toned rows. The rustle of heavy silk and velvet echoed against the vast vaulted ceilings, a restless ocean of wealth and ambition. They murmured in hushed, practiced tones. Their eyes, however, were fixed firmly on the end of the long nave where the massive altar of white stone loomed. Standing before that altar was King Alastair of House Aurelian. He looked every inch the ruthless conqueror the kingdom had come to fear and respect. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders encased in a ceremonial coat of midnight blue, heavily embroidered with silver thread. The crown upon his head, a jagged band of dark steel and flawless diamonds, caught the harsh light, casting sharp reflections across his aristocratic, unreadable face. Alastair did not fidget. He did not smile. His jaw was set like a vice. To him, this marriage to Lady Odette of House Briarwood was not a romance, it was a military maneuver. The Briarwood alliance would secure the northern borders, and in exchange, the kingdom would gain a queen trained from birth to wear the crown without faltering. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral groaned open. The massive sound echoed down the nave, instantly silencing the whispers of the nobility. The music swelled, commanding attention. The bride had arrived. She walked down the center aisle, her pace measured and perfect. The train of her gown, yards of heavy, pearl-encrusted white silk, dragged across the cold marble with a sound like a quiet rushing river. Her face was entirely obscured by a thick, shimmering veil woven from silver thread. She did not tremble. She did not look toward the throngs of nobles evaluating her every step. She moved with a strange, eerie stillness, an anchor of calm in a room suffocating with expectation. As she drew closer, the king's closest adviser, Lord Holloway, stood rigidly in the first row. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, completely at odds with the chill of the cathedral. Alastair watched the veiled figure approach. He did not feel anticipation, only the heavy, dull thud of finality. The kingdom required a queen. House Briarwood had provided one. The transaction was nearly complete. The bride stepped up to the altar. The high priest, draped in robes of gold, raised his hands. The ancient words of binding rolled over the congregation, echoing against the stone pillars. It was a blur of ritual, of ancient promises of duty and sovereignty. Alastair spoke his vows in a voice that was dark, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. Then came the moment of the sealing. The high priest stepped back. "Your Majesty," the priest intoned, the sound vibrating through the silent hall, "you may lift the veil and behold your queen." Alastair stepped forward. His gloved hands reached out, catching the edge of the silver fabric. He moved efficiently, wanting nothing more than to finalize the ceremony and return to the map room. He swept the veil back over her head. The cathedral seemed to collectively draw a breath, and then the world stopped turning. The woman standing before the King of Aurelian was not Lady Odette Briarwood. Alastair's hands froze in midair. The sharp, calculating mind that had won a dozen wars ground to an abrupt, violent halt. He stared. She was breathtaking, but not in the manufactured, painted way of the court. Her hair was a cascade of dark midnight silk, contrasting sharply with the paleness of her skin. Her features were delicate but structured with an aristocratic sharpness. But it was her eyes that caught him, deep, stormy gray eyes that held no fear, no adoration, and absolutely no apology. She was Leora, the forgotten niece of House Holloway. The quiet shadow who was never meant to stand in the light, let alone before the throne. A deafening silence slammed into the cathedral. It was so absolute that the sound of a single pearl detaching from her sleeve and striking the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. The nobles in the front rows stiffened. Gasps, hastily swallowed, began to ripple outward. The realization struck the crowd like a physical blow. The king had been deceived. The sacred altar had been mocked. Alastair's face did not contort into a mask of rage, it went terrifyingly, murderously blank. The temperature around him seemed to plummet. The diamonds in his crown flashed as he leaned in, his imposing frame looming over her. "Who?" Alastair whispered, his voice a lethal, vibrating blade meant only for her ears. "Are you?" Leora did not shrink back. She did not lower her chin. The scent of frost and iron radiated from him, a predator realizing the trap had been sprung, but she stood her ground. "I am the woman bound to you by the laws of this altar, Your Majesty," Leora replied, her voice soft and melodic, yet lined with an unbreakable core of steel. Alastair's eyes narrowed into dark slits. The betrayal burned through his veins like acid. He scanned the front rows, his gaze locking onto Lord Holloway, who suddenly looked pale and breathless, averting his eyes. Then Alastair looked back at Leora, seeing nothing but a usurper, a pawn thrust into his face to make a fool of the crown. If he halted the ceremony now, the scandal would tear the kingdom apart. Blood would spill in the streets before nightfall. The Aurelian pride could not allow the world to see the king falter, not even for a second. Alastair straightened to his full height. His jaw was locked so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. He turned his head slightly toward the high priest. "Finish it," Alastair commanded. The two words were heavy with impending doom. The high priest, shaking visibly beneath his golden robes, rushed through the final blessing. "I present to you the King and Queen of Aurelian." There was no applause. The orchestra failed to strike up the triumphant recessional. The nobles stood paralyzed, exchanging frantic, terrified glances. The air was thick with the scent of treason. Alastair did not offer Leora his arm. He turned to face the vast sea of aristocracy. His eyes swept over the hundreds of faces, ensuring every single lord and lady was watching him. He needed them to understand that a king of Aurelian was never a victim. When Alastair spoke, his voice was not a shout. It was a low, resonant baritone that projected with effortless, crushing authority to the very back of the cathedral. "Hear my first decree regarding my new bride," the king announced, his words striking the silent hall like hammer blows on an anvil. He did not look at Leora, he looked straight ahead. "I will banish her tomorrow." A collective gasp ripped through the cathedral. Someone in the third row fainted, the heavy thud of their body masked by the sudden explosion of furious, terrified whispers. Banishment. It was a sentence of social and political death. To be cast out the morning after a royal wedding was a humiliation so profound it would echo through centuries of history. It meant the king deemed her entirely worthless, a stain upon his house to be scrubbed away immediately. Every eye in the room shifted violently from the king to the new queen, waiting for the inevitable collapse. They waited for the tears, the desperate pleading, the complete shattering of a woman humiliated before the entire world. They wanted to see her fall to her knees. Leora did not fall. She stood perfectly still, the heavy silk of her gown pulling around her like sculpted marble. Slowly, she turned her head to look at the man who had just sentenced her to ruin. She did not weep. Her breathing remained steady. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the grand cathedral carried her words clearly over the frantic murmurs of the crowd. "Then I shall not burden your Majesty's sight beyond the rising of the sun," Leora said smoothly. Her tone was chillingly polite. It was the tone of a monarch dismissing a servant. The whispers in the hall died instantly. Alastair's head snapped toward her, his dark eyes flashing with a sudden, unreadable shock. He had expected begging. He had expected hysterics. He had not expected this absolute, impenetrable composure. Her dignity did not just deflect his cruelty, it absorbed it, turning his grand, terrifying decree into something that sounded almost petty. She performed a perfect, fluid curtsy, a gesture of ultimate respect executed with such icy detachment that it felt like an insult. The heavy pearls of her gown clicked softly against the stone floor. Without waiting for his permission, without waiting for the royal guard to escort her, Leora turned. She began to walk back down the long, sprawling aisle. She walked alone. The heavy train of her white dress dragged behind her, a solitary figure moving through a sea of stunned aristocrats. No one dared to breathe. They parted for her like water, stepping back as if her mere presence was dangerous. The echoing click of her heels against the marble was the only sound in the Cathedral of the Sun Kings. King Alastair stood alone at the altar, the crown heavy upon his head, watching the woman he had just thrown away walk out of the cathedral with more regal authority than half the monarchs who had preceded him. He had declared her banishment. He had publicly destroyed her. But as the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, echoing like thunder, Alastair felt an unsettling, furious tightness in his chest. Because it did not feel like a victory. It felt like a warning. The royal palace of Oakhaven sat upon a jagged cliff, a sprawling fortress of obsidian and white granite that looked as unyielding as the king who ruled it. Tonight, the palace should have been ablaze with celebration. Instead, the wedding banquet in the grand pavilion felt more like a state funeral with expensive wine. Leora was not there. She had been escorted, or rather, herded, by a pair of heavily armored, deeply uncomfortable royal guards to the Queen's apartments in the East Wing. The chambers were vast, opulent, and utterly lifeless. Heavy crimson velvet draperies suffocated the tall windows, and the massive four-poster bed looked less like a place of rest and more like a sacrificial altar. The fireplace had been lit, but the crackling flames did nothing to chase away the deep, bone-aching chill of the stone walls. Standing alone in the center of the drawing room, Leora unpinned the heavy silver veil from her hair. She dropped it. The shimmering fabric pulled onto the Persian rug like spilled quicksilver. She did not summon a maid, she knew none would come. A banished queen commanded no loyalty. With slow, methodical movements, she reached behind her back, her fingers blindly working the intricate silken laces of her wedding gown. It took time. Her fingertips were numb from the cold and the sheer suppressed adrenaline of the cathedral, but she refused to let her hands tremble. When the dress finally loosened, it slid from her shoulders and crashed to the floor, heavy with pearls and deceit. Stepping out of the ruins of her bridal gown, she donned a simple dark woolen robe she found in a wardrobe meant for ladies in waiting. She moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy velvet. Far below, the courtyard was illuminated by the flickering orange glow of torches. She could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the banquet, the sharp clinking of crystal goblets, the strained, artificial laughter of the nobility, the heavy boots on stone marching of the king's guard. They were down there drinking to her ruin. They were waiting for tomorrow's sunrise, waiting to see her dragged from the gates in disgrace. Let them wait, Leora whispered to the cold glass. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, stripped of her finery, but unbroken. While the queen stood in the shadows of her gilded cage, the king was discovering the limits of his absolute power. King Alastair had abandoned the wedding banquet before the second course was served. He had retreated to his private war room, a circular chamber dominated by a massive carved oak table covered in maps and troop deployments. But tonight, there were no generals present, only the high priest, the royal chancellor, and Lord Halloway. Lord Halloway was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Alastair stood by the roaring hearth, his ceremonial coat discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned at the throat. He looked like a wolf pacing the edge of a cage. "A mistake, Your Majesty, a catastrophic error in the procession," Halloway stammered, his voice vibrating with terror. My niece Leora, she was supposed to be in the country. We do not know how she obtained the bridal garments. Lady Odette fell ill just this morning. A sudden fever? Silence. Alastair's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a physical strike. He turned his dark, predatory gaze upon Holloway. Do not insult my intelligence with tales of sudden fevers and lost nieces. House Briarwood and House Holloway have played a dangerous game today. You substituted a forgotten pawn for a prize queen, thinking the vows would bind me before I could see the face beneath the veil. Alastair took a slow, deliberate step toward the older man. Treason is punished by the axe, Holloway. Remember that. Lord Holloway swallowed hard, shrinking back against the stone wall. Alastair turned his attention to the Royal Chancellor, a thin, greying man who clutched a thick leather-bound tome of kingdom law to his chest like a shield. The decree stands, Alastair commanded. She is banished at dawn. Draw up the papers. The Chancellor cleared his throat, his eyes darting nervously toward the High Priest. Your Majesty. I cannot. The air in the war room turned to ice. Alastair's jaw tightened. Excuse me? The laws of Oakhaven, Your Majesty, the Chancellor stuttered, opening the heavy book. The parchment pages rustled loudly in the tense silence. The vows were spoken. The sealing words were completed by the High Priest. By the laws of the gods in the realm, the woman known as Leora Holloway is legally your wife. She is the Queen of Aurelian. She is a fraud, Alastair countered, his voice rising, a low thunder warning of a storm. She is recognized, the High Priest interjected softly, bowing his head. The gods do not recognize deception in the procession, only the words spoken at the altar. To banish a crowned queen without a formal trial of treason or a sanctioned annulment would be a direct violation of the sacred pact. The nobility would fracture. The church would protest. An annulment, then? Alastair demanded, his patience fracturing. Sign it tonight. An annulment requires a tribunal, Your Majesty, the Chancellor explained, wiping his spectacles. An investigation into the substitution, testimony from House Briarwood, it requires time. Weeks, perhaps months, until the decree is signed by the High Council. She must remain in the palace. If you cast her out into the streets tomorrow, you will be breaking the ancient laws. You would look like a tyrant, not a victim of deceit. Alastair slammed his fist onto the oak table. The loud crack made all three men jump. The heavy silver goblets on the table rattled. He was trapped. The king who had conquered 3 neighboring nations in bloody combat was suddenly bound by ink and parchment. The Briarwood family had known this. They had calculated this perfectly. They had forced a lesser bride upon him to test his power, to humiliate him while keeping their true prize, Odette, safely tucked away as leverage. And they had used a girl named Leora to do it. Fine, Alastair hissed, his eyes dark with barely contained fury. She remains. But she is no queen. She is a prisoner with a title. He glared at the Chancellor. Start the annulment process immediately. I want her gone before the winter snows melt. Hours later, the palace had fallen into a deep, uneasy slumber. The torches in the corridors flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the stone. Leora was still awake. She was sitting in a high-backed leather chair near the dying fire, staring into the embers, when the heavy oak door to her chambers was unceremoniously pushed open. King Alastair walked in. He brought the cold of the corridors with him. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. He simply invaded her space, his towering presence dominating the room. Leora did not startle. She slowly turned her head to look at him, her grey eyes reflecting the faint, dying light of the fire. They stared at each other across the expanse of the room. The silence between them was not empty, it was thick, heavy with the weight of the morning's public humiliation. "You are not leaving at dawn," Alastair said abruptly. His voice was devoid of warmth, clipped and strictly professional. Leora's expression did not change. She did not display relief. "Has the king's absolute word suddenly encountered a bureaucratic delay?" she asked, her tone entirely conversational. Alastair's eyes narrowed. The fact that she was not cowering irritated him in a way he could not articulate. "You are bound by the laws of the annulment," he replied, his voice cold. "You will remain in these chambers until the tribunal clears the paperwork to erase this farce. Do not mistake this delay for mercy." "I would never accuse you of mercy, Your Majesty," Leora said softly, looking back at the fire. "It is entirely off-brand for you." A sharp, unexpected spark of surprise hit Alastair. He was used to women who either wept for his favor or schemed behind fans. He was not used to a woman who sat in the ruins of her life and delivered dry, cutting remarks to a king who could have her executed. "You will be a ghost in this palace," Alastair promised, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a menacing pitch. "You will receive no court. You will attend no functions. The servants will not answer to you. You are a stain on my floor, Leora Halloway. And I am simply waiting for the soap to wash you away." Leora finally stood up. Even in a plain woolen robe, without a crown or jewels, she possessed a regal posture that seemed intrinsic to her bones. She met his gaze directly. "I have been a ghost my entire life, Alastair," she said, omitting his title with a deliberate, shocking ease. "I know how to haunt a house far better than you know how to rule one." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. For a fleeting second, Alastair wanted to grab her shoulders and shake the infuriating calm out of her. Instead, he simply turned on his heel. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a final judgment. And so, the reign of the Phantom Queen began. Over the next 2 weeks, Alastair's decree of isolation was strictly enforced. Leora was a non-entity. When she walked the long, drafty corridors of the East Wing, the servants pressed themselves against the walls, averting their eyes as if looking at her would invite a curse. The ladies of the court, dressed in their vibrant silks, would stop their conversations mid-sentence as she passed, waiting until she was out of earshot before erupting into vicious, muffled giggles. They whispered about her constantly: the false queen, the king's mistake, the beggar bride. They expected her to hide in her chambers, weeping over her lost dignity. They expected her to waste away from the shame of being the most publicly despised woman in Oakhaven. But Leora did not hide. Every morning, she dressed impeccably in the few simple, dark gowns she had brought with her. She arranged her own hair without the help of a maid. She walked the palace grounds with her head held high, the heavy fabric of her skirts whispering against the stone floors. She did not demand respect, nor did she shrink from the disrespect shown to her. She simply observed. She noticed the dust gathering on the tapestries in the Western Gallery. She noticed the erratic schedules of the palace guards, the waste pouring from the royal kitchens, and the subtle, arrogant laziness of a staff that lacked a queen's discipline. The palace, she realized, was functioning on fear of the king, but it lacked the refined, oiled machinery that only a true matriarch could provide. She was a ghost, yes, but ghosts see everything. And a phantom with nothing to lose was the most dangerous creature in the kingdom. The underbelly of the royal palace was a labyrinth of steam, shouting, and perpetual motion. Down in the cavernous royal kitchens, the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, burning sugar, and panic. The solstice banquet was only 3 days away, a massive affair meant to project the kingdom's unyielding wealth. Yet, beneath the gilded floors of the throne room, the logistics were unraveling. Leora descended the spiraling stone servant stairs with no fanfare. She wore a simple, unadorned gown of charcoal wool, her dark hair swept up and pinned with austere precision. The hem of her dress brushed against the rough-hewn stone steps, a quiet sound entirely lost in the clamor of the kitchens. No one noticed her enter. The head chef was screaming at a terrified scullery maid over a spilled basket of winter truffles. A pair of footmen were arguing violently over the seating arrangements for the lower nobility, their voices echoing off the blackened brick arches. Chaos reigned, loud and inefficient. Leora did not shout for attention. She simply walked to the center of the vast room, stopped beside the massive oak preparation table, and picked up the chaotic stack of inventory parchments scattered across it. She read them in silence for exactly 1 minute. Then, she picked up a heavy iron cleaver resting on the table and brought the flat of the blade down against the solid oak. Bang! The sharp metallic crack cut through the shouting like a whip. The kitchen froze. The head chef spun around, his face purple with rage, ready to eviscerate whoever had dared to interrupt him. But when his eyes landed on Leora, the words died in his throat. They all knew who she was, the ghost queen, the banished bride waiting for her papers. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hiss of fat dripping into the open hearths. The eastern cellar is overstocked with root vegetables that are beginning to rot, while the southern pantry lacks the flour required for the banquet pastries, Leora stated. Her voice was not raised, yet it carried an unnatural, icy authority that demanded absolute silence. She did not look at the head chef, she kept her eyes on the ledger. Furthermore, dividing the footmen by hall rather than by table block guarantees a collision in the main corridors during the second course. She set the parchment down. Finally, she lifted her stormy grey eyes and pinned the head chef to the spot. "You are preparing a royal banquet," Leora said softly, "not a tavern brawl. Reassign for boys to clear the eastern cellar immediately. The footmen will use the servants' passage for entry and the grand doors only for clearing the tables. Fix the rotation." The head chef, a man who regularly intimidated dukes regarding their diets, blinked. His pride bristled, but his sharp mind instantly recognized the flawless logic in her commands. She had solved a logistical nightmare in 60 seconds. My lady," the chef stammered, unsure of how to address a queen the king had publicly disowned. "We take our orders from the master of the household." "The master of the household is currently drinking imported wine in the western parlor while your kitchen collapses," Leora replied, her tone perfectly flat. "You may wait for his orders and fail the king's banquet, or you may follow mine and keep your position. Choose quickly. The butter is melting." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her posture flawlessly straight, her steps echoing rhythmically against the stone. She did not wait to see if they obeyed. A queen does not look back to check if her subjects are bowing, she assumes they are. And they were. By the time Leora reached the top of the stairs, the head chef was already barking her exact orders. It started as a whisper in the scullery and spread through the servant corridors like wildfire. The false queen had come downstairs. But the tone of the whispers had shifted. The mockery was gone, replaced by a cautious, bewildered respect. In a palace ruled by a fearsome warrior king, the servants were accustomed to being terrorized. They were not accustomed to being managed. Over the next week, the invisible machinery of the palace began to change. Leora did not issue grand decrees, she simply walked the halls, a silent, watchful phantom. When the laundry maids were overwhelmed by the influx of noble guests, Leora reorganized their shifts with a few strokes of a quill on their duty roster. When a dispute arose over the rationing of winter firewood for the lower quarters, Leora calculated the exact distribution needed to keep the palace warm without depleting the reserves, leaving the ledger on the steward's desk. She never asked for gratitude. She never lingered. She appeared, excised the chaos with surgical precision, and vanished back into the shadows of the East Wing. Madame Grier, the severe, sharp-eyed head housekeeper of Oakhaven, noticed it first. One chilly afternoon, Madame Grier found Leora in the palace library, a massive circular room smelling of dust, leather, and neglected knowledge. Leora was sitting at a heavy mahogany table, calmly cross-referencing the palace's financial ledgers. "You have no authority to view those, my lady," Madame Grier said, her voice stern, though lacking its usual bite. Leora did not look up from the ink. "Someone must, Madame Grier. The king is being robbed. The merchants from the southern province have been overcharging the crown for silk and grain by 20% for the past 6 months, masking it behind shipping tariffs that do not legally exist." Madame Grier stepped closer, her eyes widening as she looked at the neat, precise annotations Leora had made in the margins. It was a massive embezzlement scheme buried deep in bureaucratic numbers. "Why are you doing this?" Madame Grier asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The king declared your banishment. He has stripped you of your name. Why do you care if his house bleeds coin?" Leora finally set down her quill. She looked at the head housekeeper, her grey eyes dark and unreadable. "Because it is an insult to order," Leora replied simply. "And because I refuse to live in a house that is crumbling, regardless of whether I am permitted to call it mine." Madame Grier stared at the young woman. In her decades of service, she had seen queens who demanded love, queens who demanded fear, and queens who cared only for their jewels. But she had never seen a woman who claimed power simply by being the most competent person in the room. Madame Grier slowly sank into a deep, formal curtsy. It was the first act of genuine respect Leora had received since stepping foot in Oakhaven. "I shall have the merchant contracts brought to your chambers for review, Your Majesty," Madame Grier murmured. Leora gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The Phantom had just claimed her first general. 2 floors above, in the sunlit and intimidating expanse of the king's study, Alastair was discovering the exact same thing. He sat behind his massive desk, frowning at the weekly reports presented by Commander Jackson, his fiercely loyal commander of the guard. The king's mind was a fortress built for war strategy and dominance. He expected his palace to run like a military camp, efficient, silent, and obedient. Lately, however, it had been running better than that. It had been running perfectly. "The dispute with the grain merchants has been settled, Your Majesty," Jackson reported, standing at attention. "The overcharges were identified and the gold recovered. Furthermore, the solstice banquet preparations are entirely under budget and ahead of schedule. The staff disputes in the Western Wing have ceased entirely." Alastair leaned back in his high leather chair, his dark brows knitting together. He tapped a heavy gold ring against the polished wood of his desk. "Who replaced the master of the household? I did not sign an order for a new appointment." Jackson hesitated. A muscle twitched in the commander's jaw. He was a man who feared no blade on the battlefield, but reporting this particular fact to the king felt like walking into an ambush. "No one replaced him, Your Majesty," Jackson said carefully. "The master of the household is still technically in his position, but the staff, they no longer report to him." Alastair's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the study seemed to drop. "Then who are they reporting to?" Jackson swallowed. "The Queen, Your Majesty." The silence that followed was suffocating. Alastair stopped tapping his ring. His dark, predatory gaze fixed on Jackson as if the man had just spoken in a demonic tongue. "Repeat that," Alastair commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Lady Leora, sire," Jackson corrected himself, using the king's preferred strict title. "She does not issue formal edicts. She simply corrects things, the ledgers, the rotations, the supply lines. The staff have begun taking their operational issues directly to her chambers. Madame Grier has practically handed her the keys to the domestic treasury." Alastair stared at his commander. His chest tightened with an entirely unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't rage, it was a sharp, jarring disruption of his reality. He had publicly humiliated her. He had stripped her of her dignity, confined her to the drafty East Wing, and promised to cast her out like garbage the moment the ink on the annulment dried. She was supposed to be a weeping, shattered mess. She was supposed to be irrelevant. Instead, she had quietly and flawlessly usurped control of his entire household right out from under him. "Leave me," Alastair snapped. Jackson bowed deeply and hastily exited the study, the heavy doors shutting with a solid thud. Alastair stood up. He walked to the tall windows, looking out over the sprawling courtyards of his kingdom. His pride, sharp and brutal, demanded that he march down to the East Wing, tear the ledgers from her hands, and remind her that she was nothing. But the strategist in him, the king who had won wars by recognizing the raw, undeniable strength of his opponents, was fascinated. House Briarwood had promised him Odette, a woman trained to smile, wave, and wear a crown beautifully, a fragile porcelain doll. But this woman, this forgotten niece of House Holloway, she did not need a crown to rule. She governed by sheer force of will and intellect. Alastair turned away from the window. He did not call for his guards. He bypassed his royal retinue entirely. The King of Oakhaven walked out of his study, his long strides eating up the distance down the grand corridors, heading toward the one place he had sworn never to visit, the East Wing. He found her in the Winter Garden, a glass-enclosed pavilion filled with dormant, frost-tipped rose bushes. The afternoon light filtered through the frosted glass panes, casting a cold, ethereal glow over the space. Leora was sitting on a stone bench, a heavy velvet cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the chill. She was reading a thick, leather-bound volume on kingdom agriculture. She did not look up when his heavy boots echoed on the stone path. She knew his step. Alastair stopped a few feet away from her. He towered over her, casting a long, dark shadow across her book. The air between them instantly crackled with a volatile, unseen energy. "You are overstepping your boundaries," Alastair stated, his voice a dark velvet threat that resonated in the quiet glass house. Leora slowly turned a page. The crisp sound of parchment was loud in the silence. She still did not look at him. "Which boundaries, Your Majesty?" she asked mildly. "The ones where I sit quietly and starve while your merchants rob you blind? Or the ones where I allow your palace to collapse into anarchy because your master of the household is an incompetent drunk?" Alastair's jaw tightened. He took a menacing step closer, his presence suffocating, demanding submission. "This is my house. You have no right to govern it." Finally, Leora closed the book. She lifted her head. Her stormy grey eyes met his furious dark gaze, and the impact was like steel striking flint. There was no fear in her, only a cool, challenging fire. "I am not governing your house, Alastair," she said softly, the use of his name alone an act of breathtaking defiance. "I am simply surviving its incompetence. If you wish for me to stop, then be a better king to your own staff, and I will gladly return to being your ghost." Alastair stared down at her. His heart gave a strange, violent thud against his ribs. He wanted to break her defiance. He wanted to drag her to her feet and remind her of his absolute power. But as he looked into her eyes, the terrifying, undeniable truth settled over the King of Oakhaven like a heavy mantle. He didn't want to break her, he wanted to know her. The truth did not arrive in Oakhaven with the blast of war horns. It arrived in the dead of night, smelling of damp wool, horse sweat, and sealing wax. King Alastair sat alone in his war room, the only light coming from the dying embers in the massive hearth and a single flickering candelabra on his desk. The rest of the palace was entombed in sleep, but the king's mind was a relentless, turning wheel. The door opened without a sound. Lord Malika, the Master of Shadows and the king's chief intelligence officer, slipped into the room like a wisp of smoke. Malika was a man who lived entirely in the dark, possessing eyes that saw every sin committed within the kingdom's borders. He approached the oak table and placed a heavy, velvet-wrapped bundle upon the maps. "The investigation into the wedding procession is complete, Your Majesty," Malika said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely disturbed the silence. Alastair's gaze snapped to the bundle. He did not speak. He simply reached out, his large, scarred hands untying the leather cords. Inside lay a stack of intercepted missives. The parchment was crisp, the wax seals broken but still bearing the distinct, arrogant crests of House Briarwood and House Halloway. "Read them to me," Alastair commanded, leaning back into the shadows of his chair. Malika picked up the first letter. This was sent by Lord Briarwood to Lord Halloway 5 days before the wedding. It reads, "The king grows too comfortable in his absolute authority. If Odette weds him now, she will be nothing but a pretty hostage to his northern campaigns. We must remind the wolf that the leash is held by the pack. Substitute your niece at the altar. Let the king swallow the Halloway cast-off. When his pride forces him to beg the High Council for an annulment, we will have the leverage to renegotiate the western borders before Odette ever sets foot in his bed. The air in the war room turned to absolute ice. Alastair's breathing slowed to a predatory, terrifying rhythm. He stared at the flickering candle, the flame reflecting in his dark eyes like a burning city. "And Halloway's reply?" Alastair asked softly. Malika unfolded a second, smaller note. "Dated 2 days before the ceremony, the girl will be compliant. She has no inheritance, no allies, and no future beyond the walls of this estate. I have informed her that any disruption at the altar will result in her immediate exile to the debtors' prisons of the lower districts. The procession will go exactly as planned. Odette may safely depart for the country. Alastair did not erupt. He did not flip the heavy oak table or shatter the crystal goblets against the stone walls. His fury was far too immense for such petty displays. It was a cold, suffocating rage that sank deep into his bones, pooling in his chest like liquid lead. He had been played. The mighty conqueror of Oakhaven had been marched up to the altar and handed a sacrificial lamb. Also a group of ambitious lords could tighten the financial noose around his throne. Odette had not fallen ill, she had been deliberately hidden away, waiting for him to break. And Leora. Alastair closed his eyes. The memory of the cathedral rushed back to him with brutal clarity, the blinding light, the heavy silver veil falling away, the terrifying murderous threat he had hissed into her face. "I will banish her tomorrow." He remembered her standing there, surrounded by hundreds of aristocrats who were waiting to watch her shatter. He remembered the icy, flawless dignity in her voice, "Then I shall not burden your Majesty's sight beyond the rising of the sun." At the time, he had viewed her calm as an insult, a brazen defiance from a usurper. Now, the truth rearranged every piece of the puzzle. Her composure was not defiance, it was armor. She had been marched to that altar under the threat of absolute ruin, forced to absorb the public humiliation meant for the men who had orchestrated it. She knew he would hate her. She knew the court would devour her. And yet she had stood tall, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her tears. Was she guarded before the ceremony? Alastair asked, his voice rough, scraping against his throat. "Heavily, sire," Malika replied. "My spies report she was kept locked in her chambers at the Halloway estate for 3 days prior. She was transported to the cathedral in a closed carriage with 4 armed men riding alongside it. She was given the veil just moments before the doors opened. She had no choice. She was a blade thrust into your side, completely unaware of the hand that held the hilt." Alastair looked down at his own hands, hands that had crushed rebellions and forged an empire. Yet he had aimed the full, devastating weight of his cruelty at a woman who had been just as trapped as he was. He had become just another tyrant in Leora Halloway's life. "Gather the guard, Your Majesty?" Malika asked quietly. "Shall we arrest Lord Halloway for treason?" "No," Alastair said softly. The word was lethal. He looked up, his eyes entirely black. If we arrest him now, House Briarwood will claim ignorance and slip the noose. They want an annulment. They want me to cast her out so they can swoop in as my saviors. I will not give them the satisfaction. Leave the documents. Tell no 1 inch. Malika bowed deeply and melted back into the shadows, leaving the king alone with the damning ink. Alastair sat in the silence for a long time. The realization of what he had done to Leora gnawed at his pride. He was a king who valued justice above all things, and he had been profoundly, publicly unjust to the one woman in the kingdom who possessed the strength to endure it without breaking. The next afternoon, the grand promenade of the palace was filled with the usual suffocating presence of the High Court. The corridor was a masterpiece of architecture, lined with towering marble columns and sweeping windows that overlooked the royal gardens. It was here that the nobility gathered to see and be seen, their heavy silk gowns hissing against the stone floors like a pit of vipers. Leora walked down the center of the promenade. She was dressed in a dark emerald velvet gown, unadorned by jewels, carrying a leather-bound ledger detailing the upcoming winter grain shipments. As she moved, the crowds of nobles parted, but not out of respect. They stepped back with exaggerated, mocking movements, whispering behind their feathered fans. The scent of their heavy perfumes was sickeningly sweet. Standing near the grand staircase was Lady Genevieve Briarwood, Odette's cousin. Genevieve was a woman who wielded cruelty like a court accessory. Seeing the Phantom Queen approaching, Genevieve stepped directly into the center of the corridor, flanked by 3 sycophantic ladies-in-waiting, effectively blocking Leora's path. Leora stopped. She did not sigh, she did not glare. She merely waited, projecting an aura of absolute stillness. "My apologies, Lady Leora," Genevieve sneered deliberately, stripping her of her royal title. Her voice was loud enough to carry down the corridor, ensuring an audience. "We were just discussing the upcoming annulment tribunal. Tell me, do you pack your own trunks for your banishment, or shall House Briarwood graciously lend you a maid? I imagine the debtor's prison does not afford much luxury." A ripple of cruel, suppressed laughter echoed from the surrounding nobles. They watched with hungry eyes, waiting for the false queen to finally crack under the weight of her isolation. Leora's stormy grey eyes locked onto Genevieve. "I manage the royal household, Lady Genevieve," Leora said, her voice melodic and chillingly even. "I know exactly where every maid in this palace is assigned, just as I know exactly how much of your family's quarterly allowance from the crown was quietly halved last month to cover your brother's staggering gambling debts in the lower city." The laughter in the corridor died instantly. Genevieve's face drained of color, her painted lips parting in shock. The ledger in Leora's hands suddenly looked less like a book of chores and more like a weapon. Before Genevieve could recover her venom, a sound cut through the suffocating silence of the promenade. It was the heavy, rhythmic, terrifying clack-clack-clack of steel-tipped boots striking the marble floor. The nobles spun around, their faces paling collectively. King Alastair was striding down the corridor. He wore his battle leathers and a dark cape that billowed ominously behind him. The temperature in the promenade plummeted. The crowd parted so fast they nearly tripped over their own expensive hems, bowing low, their eyes fixed to the floor. Alastair did not look at them. His dark, predatory gaze was locked entirely on Genevieve Briarwood. He stopped directly behind Leora. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, smelling the sharp scent of winter air and steel. It was the first time they had been this close in public since the altar. "Is there a reason," Alastair's voice resonated through the deathly silent hall, "that you are blocking my wife's path?" The word wife dropped onto the marble floor like a live grenade. Genevieve trembled so violently her feathered fan shook in her hands. She dropped into a deep, frantic curtsy, her eyes wide with terror. "Your Majesty. We were merely You were merely forgetting your place, Alistair interrupted smoothly, though the deadly edge in his tone made several nobles flinch. He stepped around Leora, placing himself between her and the Briarwood faction. His towering frame completely shielded her from their view. Let me make this exceptionally clear, Lady Genevieve, so that you may carry the message back to your uncle. The woman standing behind me wears the crown of Aurelian. She is the Queen of Oakhaven. If I ever hear a whisper, a laugh, or a single breath of disrespect directed at her from anyone in this court, I will have your tongue mounted on the doors of the throne room. Do you understand me? Genevieve choked back a sob, nodding frantically. Yes, Your Majesty. Forgive me. Get out of her sight, Alistair commanded. The Briarwood faction scrambled, lifting their skirts and fleeing down the staircase like scattered mice. The rest of the nobles in the promenade suddenly found the architecture fascinating, turning away desperately, pretending they did not exist. The corridor fell into a heavy, ringing silence. Alistair turned slowly to face Leora. The fury that had just radiated from him vanished, replaced by a complex, heavy restraint. He looked at her, truly looked at her, the dark hair, the stormy eyes, the leather ledger clutched in her hands. He saw the armor she wore, and for the first time, he recognized the terrifying strength it took to carry it. Leora did not thank him. She did not look relieved. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp and calculating. That was a dangerous declaration, Your Majesty, she said softly, ensuring the court could not hear. You just validated my position. The annulment tribunal will use those words against you. Alistair took a step closer. The air between them pulled tight, humming with a sudden, unspoken gravity. Let them try, Alistair replied, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. I am done playing by their rules, Leora. And I am done aiming my blade at the wrong target. He did not offer an apology. A king like Alistair did not know the words. But as he reached out and gently, deliberately took the heavy ledger from her hands to carry it for her, the message was universally clear. The Phantom Queen was no longer a ghost, she was under the absolute protection of the king. The heavy, relentless drumming of winter rain lashed against the towering stained glass windows of the Royal Library. The storm outside mirrored the violent, unseen shifts occurring within the stone walls of Oakhaven. Inside the cavernous room, the scent of old paper and beeswax hung heavy in the air. Leora stood near a massive mahogany table, tracing a line of text in an ancient agricultural treatise. She was entirely composed, her dark gown absorbing the dim light of the hearth. The heavy oak doors opened with a dull groan. King Alistair entered, shedding a rain-slicked riding cloak and tossing it to a waiting servant before dismissing the man with a flick of his hand. His boots struck the marble floor with deliberate, echoing thuds as he closed the distance between them. Since the incident in the Grand Promenade, a fragile, volatile truce had settled over them. But Alistair was a man accustomed to defining the terms of every treaty, and Leora's impenetrable silence was driving him to the edge of his formidable patience. You have not spoken a word to me in 3 days, Alistair said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. Leora did not look up from her book. I was not aware the king required my conversation, Your Majesty. I assumed my quiet competence was sufficient. Alistair stepped closer, placing his large, scarred hand flat on the open pages of her book, forcing her to stop reading. I defended your honor before the entire court. I silenced House Briarwood's vipers. Yet you look at me as if I am still the enemy. Leora slowly lifted her stormy grey eyes to meet his. Her gaze was not grateful, it was piercingly analytical. You did not defend my honor, Alistair, she said softly, her voice cool and precise. You defended your own pride. Genevieve Briarwood was insulting the crown. And because I unfortunately wear it, you stepped in. Do not ask me to fall to my knees in gratitude because you finally decided that your own household should not mock you. The absolute truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. His jaw tightened. The fierce conqueror of the North was entirely disarmed by a woman wielding nothing but logic and flawless dignity. I am trying to correct a grave error, Alastair growled, leaning in closer, the scent of rain and iron radiating from him. I am offering you the protection of the throne. Leora didn't flinch from his proximity. She stood her ground, an immovable pillar of quiet strength. I do not want to be your protected pet, locked in the East Wing while you wage war against the nobles who tricked you. I am not a pawn to be passed from my uncle's hand to yours. You stood at the altar and promised the kingdom you would banish me. The tribunal convenes tomorrow at noon. Until the ink is dry on either my death warrant or my annulment, do not pretend we are allies. She pulled the book smoothly from beneath his hand, closed it with a sharp snap, and walked past him. Alastair stood frozen in the library, his blood roaring in his ears. Her pride was magnificent. It was a terrifying, beautiful weapon. And for the first time in his life, the King of Oakhaven realized that absolute power could not buy the one thing he suddenly, desperately wanted, her willing choice to stay. The storm broke the next morning, leaving Oakhaven bathed in a harsh, cold sunlight. The peace of the palace was shattered by the crunch of heavy carriage wheels against the gravel of the grand courtyard. The banners of House Briarwood, a silver rose entangled in black thorns, snapped violently in the winter wind. Lord Arthur Briarwood descended from the carriage, his velvet cloak sweeping the ground. He possessed the smooth, polished arrogance of a man who believed he owned the board. Behind him stepped Lady Odette Briarwood. Odette was exactly what the kingdom expected of a queen. Her golden hair was perfectly coiffed, her skin flawless, and her gown a magnificent display of sky-blue silk and diamonds. She looked at the obsidian walls of the royal palace, not with awe, but with the calculating gaze of an heiress inspecting her new property. She did not look like a woman who had just recovered from a sudden, violent fever. Alastair received them in the grand audience chamber. He sat upon the iron throne of Aurelian, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask of dark stone. Your Majesty, Lord Briarwood said, bowing deeply. Odette performed a flawless, sweeping curtsy. We humbly beg your forgiveness for the tragic misunderstanding at the cathedral. My daughter's sudden illness sent our household into chaos, and Lord Holloway acted in a panic. But the gods be praised, she is fully recovered and ready to take her rightful place by your side. Alastair looked down at them from the dais. His silence stretched heavy and oppressive, making the nobles in the room shift uncomfortably. Odette smiled, a perfectly practiced expression of gentle sorrow. It broke my heart to know of the humiliation you endured, Your Majesty, Odette added. I only wish the annulment tribunal could have convened sooner to rid you of that unfortunate mistake. The words hung in the air, unfortunate mistake. Alastair's hands gripped the carved armrests of the throne. He imagined Leora down in the East Wing, managing the palace ledgers, ensuring the fires in the great halls were lit, and enduring the whispers of these very people without ever breaking her stride. He looked at Odette's perfect, empty smile and felt an overwhelming wave of disgust. The tribunal meets at noon, Lord Briarwood, Alastair finally spoke, his voice dangerously soft. The matter of the Queen will be settled then. Until that hour, you will wait. He stood abruptly, his dark cape billowing, and strode out of the chamber before Briarwood could utter another word. He needed air. He needed to prepare for the political slaughter he was about to unleash in the tribunal. But as the king marched down the corridor, Commander Jackson intercepted him. Jackson looked uncharacteristically pale. Your Majesty, Jackson said, bowing quickly. Forgive the intrusion, but there is a matter in the East Wing. Alastair stopped, his blood suddenly running cold. Has Briarwood's faction dared to approach her? No, sire. Jackson swallowed hard. The Queen has requested a royal carriage be prepared at the eastern gates. She is packing her trunks. The world tilted. What? Alastair breathed. She is leaving, Your Majesty. Before the tribunal even convenes. Alastair did not wait for further explanation. He shoved past his commander, his long legs eating up the distance as he broke into a near run toward the Queen's apartments. He ignored the shocked gasps of the servants and the frantic salutes of his guards. He burst through the heavy oak doors of Leora's chambers without knocking. The room was quiet. The heavy velvet curtains were tied back, letting the cold morning light spill across the floor. In the center of the room sat a single, modest leather trunk, closed and strapped tight. A young maid stood in the corner, quietly weeping into her apron. Leora stood by the vanity, fastening a dark woolen traveling cloak around her shoulders. She turned as the heavy doors crashed against the stone walls. Her expression remained entirely unchanged, calm, collected, and devastatingly serene. "Leave us." Alastair barked at the maid. The girl practically fled the room, shutting the door behind her. Alastair stared at the leather trunk, his chest heaving as if he had just run 1,000 miles in full armor. He looked at Leora. She was not dressed in the silks of a queen, she was dressed for a harsh winter road. "What is the meaning of this?" Alastair demanded, his voice thick with an emotion he refused to name. "I am making the logistics easier for your tribunal, Your Majesty," Leora replied, her tone conversational. She picked up a pair of leather riding gloves. House Briarwood has arrived. The stage is set for their grand reconciliation. I have no desire to sit in a room and have old men debate my right to exist before they hand you a piece of paper telling you to discard me. So, I am discarding myself. I did not give you permission to leave." Alastair roared, the absolute authority of the king snapping like a whip. Leora paused. She looked at him, her stormy eyes completely fearless. "You do not own me, Alastair," she said softly. "You rejected me at the altar. You promised the kingdom my banishment. I endured your palace because the law demanded it, not because I am your subject to command. I was placed here without my consent. I will not remain here without my choice." "Where will you go?" he asked, stepping toward her, the desperation bleeding through the cracks of his royal fury. "You have no inheritance. Your uncle will cast you into the streets." "I will survive," Leora answered smoothly. "I have always survived. I will go somewhere quiet where I am not a problem to be solved in someone else's kingdom." Alastair closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches from her. He looked down into her face, searching for a trace of a bluff, a plea for him to stop her. There was none. She was entirely prepared to walk out of Oakhaven and never look back. The realization struck the king with the force of a battering ram. He had spent his life hoarding power, expanding borders, and commanding armies. Yet standing before this quiet, banished bride with her single leather trunk, he felt entirely powerless. If she walked out that door, she would take the very soul of the palace with her. She would take the order, the quiet strength, and the fierce, unyielding dignity that had brought a warrior king to his knees. Alastair's hands trembled slightly, a man who had faced 1,000 swords without blinking. He reached out, his large fingers gently grasping the heavy wool of her cloak, holding onto her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. "I don't want you to survive," Alastair whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of a terrifying, absolute truth. Leora's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of uncertainty finally breaking her pristine calm. "That is not a command." "No," Alastair replied, his dark eyes burning into hers. The fierce pride of the king shattered, leaving only the man behind the crown. "It is a choice. My choice." The great hall of Oakhaven was prepared for a public execution, though no block or axe had been brought to the dais. The execution was to be of a woman's name, her future, and her dignity. It was exactly noon. The blinding winter sun pierced through the massive stained glass windows, casting fractured pools of ruby and sapphire light across the pristine marble floor. The hall was packed to its absolute limits. Every lord, lady, minister, and general had gathered, their heavy silk gowns and velvet coats rustling like a restless, glittering ocean. They had come to watch the king fulfill his dark promise. They had come to watch the false queen be discarded. In the front row, the Briarwood faction stood with the radiant confidence of conquerors. Lord Arthur Briarwood wore a triumphant, thin smile, his hands clasped neatly over his silver-headed cane. Beside him, Lady Odette was a vision of manufactured perfection. She wore a gown of shimmering silver, the exact shade of the royal Aurelian crest, a presumptuous sartorial choice that declared she was already measuring the throne for herself. Lady Genevieve stood slightly behind them, practically vibrating with vicious anticipation. On the opposite side, Lord Holloway stood sweating, his eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak doors, knowing his own survival depended entirely on the king's willingness to sweep the wedding substitution under the rug. A sharp, deafening blast of silver trumpets echoed through the cavernous space. The restless murmuring of the nobility ceased instantly, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. The heavy side doors opened, and King Alastair entered. He did not walk like a man coming to sign a bureaucratic concession, he walked like a warlord stepping onto a freshly conquered battlefield. He wore his crown of dark steel and diamonds, the sharp points catching the light, and a heavy cloak of midnight velvet that swept the floor with a rhythmic, menacing hiss. His face was an impenetrable mask of carved granite, his dark eyes unreadable. As he ascended the marble steps to the Iron Throne, the entire hall bowed in a synchronized wave. Alastair did not grant them permission to rise immediately. He let them hold the uncomfortable posture, asserting the absolute weight of his power. Finally, with a slight flick of his gloved hand, the court straightened. The royal chancellor stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he held a silver tray bearing a thick parchment and a heavy gold quill. "Your Majesty," the chancellor intoned, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The High Council has convened. The tribunal has reached an expedited consensus regarding the tragic deception at the altar. The documents of annulment are prepared. You need only sign, and the false bond will be severed." Lord Briarwood stepped forward, bowing deeply. "A dark chapter in Oakhaven's history draws to a close today, Your Majesty. House Briarwood stands ready to restore the light to your reign." Odette lowered her eyes in a picture of modest devotion, though her lips curved into a distinct, victorious smirk. Alastair looked at the silver tray. He did not reach for the pen. Before the silence could stretch into confusion, the massive oak doors at the far end of the great hall groaned open. Every head in the room snapped around. Leora walked in. She did not enter as a prisoner, nor did she creep in as a disgraced outcast. She wore the dark emerald velvet gown from the day before, utterly devoid of the heavy diamonds and pearls the court so desperately valued. Her dark hair was pinned up in a severe, flawless crown of braids. She walked down the long center aisle with the slow, terrifying grace of a monarch inspecting her subjects. The nobles parted for her instinctively, stepping back from the sheer force of her presence. The rhythmic click of her footsteps on the marble was the only sound in the vast hall. She did not look at Lord Holloway, who was visibly trembling. She did not look at Odette, whose smirk had instantly vanished into a tight, furious line. Leora stopped at the base of the dais. She met Alastair's dark gaze. It was a private, searing exchange held in front of 1,000 people, a silent question of whether the choice he had spoken of in her chambers would hold under the blinding light of the court. "The lady has arrived," Lord Briarwood said loudly, attempting to mask his sudden unease with bravado. "Excellent. Let her witness the restoration of order." Alastair finally reached out. He picked up the heavy gold quill from the silver tray. A collective breath was held across the room. The moment of destruction was here. He held the quill over the parchment. He looked out over the sea of aristocrats, his gaze slowly sweeping past the expectant faces, settling finally on Arthur Briarwood. I stood in this very hall weeks ago, Alastair's voice boomed, rich and dangerous, carrying to the furthest corners without effort. I looked at this woman, and I made a declaration before the gods and the nobility. I said I would banish her. Several nobles nodded eagerly. Odette's chest swelled with pride. Alastair's fingers loosened. The heavy gold quill slipped from his grasp. It hit the silver tray with a sharp, piercing clatter that echoed like a shattered sword. I was wrong, the king declared. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the terrifying stillness of the ocean pulling back just before a tidal wave strikes. Odette's face drained of all color. Lord Briarwood blinked, his arrogant smile freezing into a mask of pure shock. Your Majesty, Briarwood stammered, his polished composure cracking. I do not understand. The annulment. There will be no annulment, Alastair stated, his voice dropping into a lethal register. Because there was no mistake. There was only treason. At the word treason, a collective gasp ripped through the great hall. From the shadows behind the throne, Lord Malacca, the Master of Shadows, materialized. He walked down the steps and dropped a heavy wooden lockbox onto the Chancellor's table. He threw it open, revealing stacks of intercepted letters, ledgers, and heavy pouches of gold. House Briarwood and House Holloway conspired to mock the crown, Alastair continued, his voice rising like dark thunder, shaking the stone walls. You paid the steward of the procession. You threatened a young woman with a debtor's prison to force her into my cathedral as a sacrificial pawn. Lady Odette's miraculous fever was nothing but a calculated retreat, a cowardly ploy to force my hand and extort my boarders. Lies. Lord Briarwood shouted, losing all sense of protocol, his face turning a mottled crimson. This is a fabrication. House Briarwood is loyal. I have the ink bearing your seal, Arthur, Alastair snarled, his eyes flashing with murderous intent. I have the confessions of the couriers you bribed. You sought to humiliate the King of Oakhaven to measure the length of his leash. You forgot that the wolf does not wear a leash. He bites through the bone. Alastair raised his hand. The massive doors of the hall slammed shut, barred from the outside. Dozens of heavily armored royal guards poured from the side aisles, their steel boots thundering against the marble, their halberds lowering in unison. They surrounded the Briarwood faction and Lord Holloway in a ring of impenetrable, deadly steel. Odette shrieked as a guard grabbed her arm, her perfect silver gown tangling around her legs. Lady Genevieve began to sob hysterically, sinking to the floor. Lord Holloway simply collapsed in a dead faint. Take them to the black cells, Alastair commanded, his voice utterly devoid of mercy. They will face the High Magistrate for high treason by nightfall. The court watched in paralyzed horror as the most powerful family in the kingdom was stripped of their dignity, dragged away like common thieves. The echoing screams of Odette Briarwood faded down the corridor, leaving behind a hall suffocating in fear. The nobles, who had spent weeks laughing at the Phantom Queen, now stared at the floor, terrified that the king's wrath would turn on them next. But Alastair did not look at the court. He turned his attention back to the base of the dais. He stepped down from the Iron Throne. He bypassed the Chancellor. He walked down the marble steps until he stood directly in front of Leora. The fury that had just radiated from him, the terrifying aura of the conqueror, dissolved the moment he looked at her. The court held its breath, expecting him to order her away, expecting some final lingering punishment. Instead, Alastair reached out. He did not grab her arm as a possession, he extended his large, scarred hand, offering it to her with a reverence he had never shown another living soul. Leora looked at his hand, her stormy grey eyes lifted to meet his. You asked me this morning, Alastair said, his voice quiet, meant only for her, but carrying enough in the dead silence for the front rows to hear the raw, unshielded honesty in it. He spoke of whether he was keeping her out of duty, if he was tying her to a house that did not want her. Leora's breath hitched just slightly. The impenetrable armor she had worn for weeks finally, beautifully, began to crack. I am not keeping you, Leora, Alastair said softly. I'm asking you to stay. Because I was handed a pawn, and I discovered a queen. I chose you in the library. I choose you before the court. And if you walk out those doors, I will burn this palace to the ground because it is entirely worthless without you. It was the ultimate surrender of a warlord. Leora looked at the man who had promised her ruin, the man who had just ripped apart his own kingdom's political structure simply to ensure she would never be insulted again. Slowly, an achingly beautiful, genuine smile touched her lips, the first she had ever shown in Oakhaven. She lifted her hand and placed it firmly into his. Alastair's fingers closed around hers in a warm, unbreakable grip. He turned them both to face the vast sea of the aristocracy. He did not need a crown to place upon her head, she already possessed more majesty than the gold could ever provide. Behold your queen. Alastair's voice rang out, absolute and final. Her word is my own. Her enemies are my own. Any who fail to recognize her sovereignty will answer to my blade. For a split second, the hall hesitated. Then, the royal chancellor dropped to his knees, his robes pooling on the marble. Commander Jackson followed, dropping to one knee with a sharp clatter of armor like a wave crashing against the shore. The entire great hall descended. The arrogant lords, the vicious ladies, the whispering sycophants, hundreds of aristocrats sank to the cold stone floor, bowing their heads in absolute submission. Leora stood beside the king, looking out over the kneeling kingdom. She had arrived as a mistake, dressed in borrowed silk. She had endured the darkness of the shadows, and now, without ever having to beg for it, she had conquered them all. The cold winter light from the windows caught them, illuminating a king who had finally learned how to yield and a queen who had never needed to wear a crown to rule. What a journey of power, patience, and ultimate justice. Leora proved that true royalty isn't about the jewels you wear, but the storms you can endure without breaking. The king thought he was casting aside a worthless pawn, only to realize he was letting go of the only woman strong enough to stand beside him. If you were in Leora's place, standing before the king in the library when he finally asked you to stay, would you have chosen to forgive him and take the throne? Or would you have walked out those doors and never looked back? Tell us your choice in the comments below. If you love stories of royal revenge, hidden truths, and dramatic, hard-earned romance, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The court is always full of secrets, and you won't want to miss the next scandal. Until then, remember, a true queen never begs.